Commander Zeroth stood in the observation deck of his flagship, watching the holographic projections of Earth. His expression was one of cold calculation, the same look he had worn for centuries while subjugating countless worlds. The humans were nothing special, just another species that had dared to evolve in the wrong part of the galaxy. His empire, the Draer, had crushed civilizations more advanced than this backwater planet. The preliminary data on humanity was unimpressive. Their technological capabilities were centuries behind the Draer. Their spacefaring efforts were laughable, with a few flimsy stations orbiting their planet and sparsely populated colonies on nearby moons. No shields, no interstellar weaponry, no fleet to speak of. Earth would fall within days, if not hours. Zeroth had no doubt of that. "Begin the strikes," Zeroth ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't bother to watch the initial bombardment. This was routine, after all. A few orbital stations, some satellites, nothing that would stand against the might of the Draer Empire. The pattern was always the same. Strike first, then demand surrender. Those who resisted were obliterated. Those who surrendered became part of the Empire's ever-growing dominion. His officers monitored the assault, waiting for the inevitable human response. Zeroth knew what it would be. Fear, confusion, panic. The humans would scramble to defend themselves, quickly realizing the futility of their efforts. Within hours, they would be on their knees, begging for mercy. Every species they had ever encountered reacted the same way. But something strange happened. The reports came in from the first strike. Human satellites had been disabled, orbital defenses neutralized, and yet, no signs of panic. Zeroth frowned as he scanned the data. His officers murmured quietly amongst themselves, equally perplexed. The humans weren't broadcasting desperate pleas for peace. They weren't offering their unconditional surrender. In fact, they weren't saying anything at all. "How strange," Zeroth muttered to himself. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as he examined the data more closely. There was movement, yes, human forces were mobilizing. But instead of frantic disarray, their efforts were organized, coordinated. Earth's nations had begun pooling resources, forming a unified defense effort. "Resistance?" one of his officers asked, confused. "Sir, they should be in chaos by now." Zeroth didn't answer immediately. He was already calculating, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't how things usually went. Most species fell into disarray at the first sign of a Draer attack, but the humans, they were calm. Resolute, even. "Perhaps they don't understand the magnitude of the threat," Zeroth said finally, his voice cold. "Continue with the attacks? Let them see what happens when they resist the Draer." The Draer forces launched a second wave of attacks, targeting human colonies on Mars and various space stations. The strikes were swift and devastating. Zeroth watched the live feeds as explosions lit up the barren Martian landscape, the human structures crumbling under the assault. Once again, Zeroth waited for the inevitable response: panic, surrender, begging. But none came. Instead, the humans simply adjusted. Their defense systems kicked into gear, and within minutes, they were already countering the attacks. No one cried out in terror. No desperate pleas for mercy. It was as though they had been expecting this all along. "They are holding the line," an officer remarked, astonished. Zeroth's mind raced. These humans were an anomaly. Not the first species to resist, of course, but the first to do so with such composure. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting like they expected to win. "Humans are different," Zeroth said slowly, more to himself than to his crew. "They are not afraid." This disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Fear was a powerful tool, one that the Draer relied upon to break their enemies before a true war even began. But if the humans weren't afraid, then they wouldn't break easily. They would fight harder, longer. And that could complicate things. "Prepare for the next phase," Zeroth commanded. He turned back to the display of Earth, narrowing his eyes. "We will crush them with sheer numbers." Still, doubt crept into the corners of his mind. The humans were not behaving as expected. Most species folded after the initial show of force, but Earth had not. Instead, they were reinforcing their defenses, rallying their forces, and preparing for what was to come. There was a quiet defiance about them, something that unsettled Zeroth deeply. They are bluffing, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. They cannot possibly withstand the full might of the Draer. But in his gut, Zeroth knew something was different about these humans. He could see it in the way they fought back, not with panic, but with precision. They weren't afraid of him. They weren't afraid of war. The Draer fleet began preparing for the full invasion, their warships moving into position. Zeroth steeled himself, pushing aside his doubts. The humans would crumble, just like every other species had crumbled before them. They had to. It was inevitable. And yet, as he watched the humans prepare for his invasion, a single question echoed in the back of his mind, one that he couldn't shake. Why aren't they afraid? General Olivia Carter stood at the helm of Earth's Defense Command, her eyes scanning the reports that had flooded in from across the globe. Nations that once bickered and quarreled over the smallest of disputes were now working together with a precision that was both inspiring and terrifying. For the first time in human history, Earth had one singular purpose: survival. The Draer had come out of nowhere, their initial strikes taking out crucial satellites and disabling communication systems. But instead of panicking, humanity had adapted. General Carter had always believed in humanity's ability to rise above its challenges, but what she was witnessing now was beyond anything she could have anticipated. Nations that had once been at odds were sharing resources, military forces were combining under a single command, and scientists were collaborating across borders to find any edge against the alien invaders. She looked at the holomap that displayed Earth's defenses. It wasn't perfect, there were still holes in their strategy, and the Draer fleet loomed large above them, but it was a start. More importantly, it was proof of what humans could achieve when they set aside their differences. Dr. Marcus Holden entered the room, his expression serious but hopeful. "General, we've made progress with the reverse engineering." "Show me," Carter said, her tone clipped but not unkind. Holden had been leading a team of scientists tasked with studying the fragments of Draer technology recovered from the battlefield. So far, their advancements had been slow, but even the smallest breakthroughs could turn the tide. Holden pulled up a schematic on the display, showing what looked like an alien energy weapon. "We've managed to understand the basic principles behind their energy shielding. It's remarkably advanced, but we've identified a weakness, something we can exploit. We can retrofit our weapons to penetrate their shields, at least temporarily." Carter's eyes widened. "How long will it take to implement this?" "We've already begun. I've got teams across the globe working on adapting our defense systems. If all goes well, we should be able to deploy these new weapons in time for the next wave of attacks." Carter nodded, her mind already racing through the implications. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to adapt. Now they were doing it on a global scale. "Good work, Holden. We're going to need every advantage we can get." From the perspective of the Draer, this rapid adaptation was perplexing. Commander Zeroth monitored the humans' efforts with growing unease. This level of coordination was unheard of, at least among the species they had conquered. Most civilizations crumbled under the weight of invasion, but the humans seemed to be growing stronger, not weaker. "They are acting like a cornered animal," one of Zeroth's officers remarked, watching the humans organize their forces. "Desperate. Perhaps we are pushing them too hard too fast." Zeroth scowled at the display. "No. This is not desperation. This is something else. Something we haven't seen before." The humans were adapting too quickly for his liking. They had begun launching small counterattacks, probing the edges of the Draer fleet. At first, Zeroth had dismissed these skirmishes as futile attempts to slow the inevitable. But now, with each passing day, the humans grew bolder, more calculated in their strikes. "They're learning," Zeroth muttered, narrowing his eyes. "They're learning from us." Back on Earth, the first wave of newly adapted human weapons was ready. General Carter stood before a gathered assembly of military leaders, her voice firm and resolute. "We've been underestimated," she said. The Dracker think they can break us with brute force. But they don't understand what it means to fight for survival. We've been fighting each other for centuries. Now we fight for all of us." The room erupted in applause, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Morale was crucial in times like this, and Carter knew that the belief in victory was half the battle. The other half was being prepared to do whatever it took to achieve it. As the next Dracker assault came, the humans were ready. This time, when the Dracker's ships descended on human defenses, they were met with a new and deadly resistance. Holden's team had done their work well. The new weapons tore through the Dracker's shields with precision. For the first time, the alien invaders found themselves on the defensive. Reports flooded in from all across the planet. Human forces had launched a coordinated counteroffensive, targeting key Dracker outposts in orbit and on the surface. The battle was fierce, but this time, the humans were holding their own. They weren't just surviving, they were winning. Commander Zeroth received the news with disbelief. A key Dracker outpost had fallen, its defenses overwhelmed by human ingenuity. It was the first time his forces had experienced a true loss in this campaign, and it shook the entire command structure of the Dracker fleet. "How is this possible?" one of his officers asked, his voice tinged with fear. "These primitives. They shouldn't be able to." "They are not primitives," Zeroth interrupted, his tone cold and deadly. He stared at the reports, his mind racing. The humans had done what no other species had been able to do. They had turned the tide. Not through superior firepower or technology, but through their unyielding determination to survive. Zeroth realized he had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated humanity. They weren't just another species to be conquered. They were something else entirely, something more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The humans had proven themselves to be a much more dangerous enemy than Zeroth had anticipated. Their capacity to adapt, to unite, to fight with every fiber of their being, it was unlike anything he had seen in his long career. And it forced him to reconsider his entire strategy. "They're not afraid of us," Zeroth muttered under his breath, the words tasting bitter. "They're not afraid of anything." The realization gnawed at him as he prepared for the next phase of the invasion. This would not be a simple conquest. The humans would not surrender easily. They would fight until their last breath, and that made them more dangerous than any weapon. As he stared out into the void, watching the scattered human forces regroup for yet another counterattack, Zeroth felt a rare emotion creep into his chest, something he had not felt in centuries. Doubt. The Dracker invasion force descended on Earth in full strength, their massive fleets blotting out the sky in key cities around the globe. Waves of battleships and ground troops flooded the atmosphere, overwhelming Earth's defenses with sheer numbers. Their superiority in firepower was undeniable. From the perspective of Commander Zeroth, this was the final phase. Earth would fall under the relentless might of the Dracker, and humanity would be crushed into submission. The human forces, few in comparison, seemed insignificant, and Zeroth believed their resistance would be swiftly obliterated. But as the invasion began, it quickly became clear that the humans were not going to be broken easily. General Carter, resolute and unwavering, had anticipated the overwhelming numbers. Her strategy was not to engage the Dracker head-on but to turn Earth's very nature into a weapon. Guerrilla tactics became the order of the day. The human forces melted into the terrain, using the mountains, forests, and cities as natural cover. Their attacks were quick and brutal, with hit-and-run strikes that harassed and disoriented the Dracker. Despite their technological inferiority, the humans used what they had with surgical precision. Drone swarms, missile barrages from hidden positions, and targeted artillery strikes all hit the invaders where it hurt. The Dracker's expectation of a quick victory was shattered as their forces found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by smaller, faster units. The terrain they thought would be inconsequential had become their enemy, and every step forward was met with deadly resistance. Zeroth, watching from his flagship, couldn't believe what he was seeing. This level of coordination and strategic cunning from a species that was supposed to be primitive? It was unthinkable. He could see his forces bogged down, unable to make significant progress as they were constantly harassed by these guerrilla fighters. Every hour brought reports of more losses, a battalion wiped out by a well-placed bomb, a key communications relay destroyed by a sniper team. The humans were everywhere, and yet nowhere, always hitting the Draer where they were weakest. The ferocity of the human defenders took the Draer by surprise. These were not warriors fighting for glory or conquest. They fought for survival. And when survival is at stake, every human, soldier or civilian, became a weapon. Civilians, farmers, and factory workers took up arms alongside trained soldiers, creating a chaotic but effective defense network that exploited every weakness the Draer displayed. The sheer willpower of the human population stunned the invaders. They had never faced a foe that fought with such tenacity. As the battle wore on, it became clear that this was more than a simple conflict of numbers and technology. The Draer forces, so used to overwhelming their enemies through intimidation and firepower, were now being outwitted at every turn. Human snipers, in particular, became a symbol of fear for the Draer. These unseen hunters would pick off commanders, sabotage critical equipment, and disappear before the Draer even knew what hit them. Zeroth's forces began to falter, not because of their numbers but because of fear. Fear of an enemy that seemed to thrive on resistance. Commander Zeroth felt the weight of each loss in his bones. His initial confidence began to crack. For the first time in centuries, he questioned whether brute force alone could win this war. The Draer had always believed in their superiority, but the humans were showing them something different. It wasn't their technology that made them dangerous. It was their refusal to give in, no matter the odds. On the ground, the battles raged across continents, in every city, and on every battlefield. Human forces, with their hit-and-run tactics, managed to stall the Draer's advance. Even when outnumbered, they fought with an intensity that shocked the invaders. For every Draer strike, the humans responded tenfold with cunning traps and well-coordinated ambushes. Soldiers fought not just for themselves but for the families hidden in underground bunkers, for the future of humanity, and for a planet that had never known unity until now. The battlefield was not just about weapons and tactics. It was about the human spirit, and that was something the Draer hadn't anticipated. Psychological warfare became the humans' greatest weapon. Draer troops began to hesitate, their movements slowed by the constant knowledge that an unseen enemy was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Draer were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. Zeroth watched in disbelief as entire divisions of his troops became paralyzed by fear. They had never experienced this before, a species that wasn't afraid to fight, to bleed, and to die for something larger than themselves. The turning point came when the humans managed to launch a successful counteroffensive. Using the new weapons reverse-engineered by Dr. Holden's team, human forces struck a Draer outpost in Eastern Europe, demolishing it in a single coordinated attack. The victory sent shockwaves through the Draer command. This was the first major defeat the Draer had ever suffered in this war, and it sent a clear message. Humanity wasn't just surviving, they were fighting back. Zeroth's confidence, already wavering, now crumbled under the weight of this defeat. How could this be possible? The Draer had faced countless enemies across the stars, but none had ever pushed them back like this. His entire belief in Draer's superiority, in their right to conquer, was unraveling. What made the humans so different? As the dust settled from the counteroffensive, Earth's defenders regrouped, preparing for the next phase of the war. The battle was far from over, but they had proven something to themselves and to their enemy: they could win. For the first time in the war, Commander Zeroth was forced to reevaluate everything. His strategy, his approach, his understanding of the humans, it had all been wrong. This species would not be conquered easily. They would not break. And now, Zeroth was left with no choice but to prepare for one final, desperate attack. But in the back of his mind, he knew something had changed. The humans had shown the Draer what they were truly capable of. They had shown that they weren't just another species to be dominated. They had shown that when pushed to the brink, humanity was a force like no other. And that terrified Zeroth more than any weapon ever could. The Draer fleet loomed above Earth, preparing for one final assault. This time, Zeroth was determined to end the humans once and for all. His forces were battered but still massive, and their overwhelming numbers should have been enough to crush any remaining resistance. The humans, despite their stubbornness, could not hold out forever. It was only a matter of time. Zeroth believed that a direct, full-force attack would finally break them. As the landing ships touched down on Earth, the Draer soldiers stormed out, expecting to sweep through the human defenses. Yet something was off. Their initial advances were met with silence. No immediate human response. No frantic scrambling to hold the line. Instead, there was a chilling calm, as if the humans had anticipated this moment all along. It didn't take long for the Draer to realize they had walked into a trap. The humans had been ready for this, luring the Draer into well-planned ambushes. Every step forward became a fight for survival. Hidden explosives, sniper fire from unseen locations, and unexpected assaults from guerrilla units began to tear through the Draer ranks. What should have been a swift, final strike turned into chaos. General Carter had expected this moment. Her forces were stretched thin, many were wounded, and supplies were low. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was survival, and for humans, survival had always meant more than just holding on. It meant fighting for everything they loved. She had watched as her soldiers fought not just for themselves, but for their families, their homes, their planet. This was not just a war for territory or resources. This was about defending the very essence of what it meant to be human. As the Draer forces struggled to regroup under the relentless human attacks, they started to falter. Their once confident steps became hesitant, their communications grew panicked, and their morale began to crumble. For the Draer, this level of resistance was alien. They had never faced such an enemy before. Most species broke under pressure, their will shattered after the first wave of destruction. But the humans? They fought harder. They fought as if nothing could stop them. Commander Zeroth watched the battle unfold, a sinking feeling growing in his chest. His forces were being torn apart by a species that, by all logical reasoning, should have been easy to conquer. But logic didn't apply here. The humans weren't fighting out of fear. They weren't fighting for conquest or power. They were fighting for something far deeper, something that made them unbreakable. In the midst of the chaos, Zeroth's mind raced. He had studied the humans, analyzed their technology, and found them lacking. But what he had failed to understand was that humanity's strength didn't lie in technology or numbers. It lay in their ability to endure. For centuries, humans had fought wars, against nature, against themselves, and now against the Draer. War was not something they feared. It was something they had lived through time and time again. This realization hit Zeroth like a hammer. The humans did not fear war because they had learned to survive it. They had learned to adapt, to fight with everything they had, and to never surrender. War was not a force to be avoided for them. It was a force to be faced head-on, no matter the cost. The battle raged on, but it became clear that the Draer were losing ground. The humans had used Earth itself as a weapon, turning their terrain into an impenetrable fortress. The Draer, used to dominating open spaces and crushing resistance with sheer firepower, were outmatched by the humans' tactical genius. Every hill, every building, every piece of land became a tool in the humans' hands, and they wielded it with precision. The climactic battle reached its peak when human forces, in a coordinated strike, overwhelmed the Draer's command center. With their leadership in disarray and their forces scattered, the Draer began to retreat. Humanity had outsmarted them at every turn. The unthinkable had happened. A species that should have been conquered in days had turned the tables and defeated one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. As the last of the Draer ships pulled away from Earth's surface, Zeroth stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring down at the planet below. His once unshakable confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow realization. He had underestimated humanity, and it had cost him everything. The Draer Empire had never known defeat like this. And now Zeroth understood why. Humans were not just another species. They were not just another conquest. They were something more. Something terrifying. Their resilience, their adaptability, their refusal to give in, these were not traits to be underestimated. They were traits that made them more dangerous than any advanced weapon or fleet. In his reflection, Zeroth realized that humanity's true strength lay in their unity. When pushed to the brink, they didn't crumble. They stood together, stronger than ever. They fought not for conquest, but for survival, for their families, and for their freedom. And that made them invincible. Defeated, Zeroth knew that the Draer could never return to Earth. The cost would be too great. Humanity had shown that they were not a species to be trifled with. Any empire that dared provoke them would face the same fate. They were a force of nature, impossible to conquer because they were driven by something far more powerful than fear. As Zeroth's fleet retreated into the cold expanse of space, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the humans. They had taught him a painful lesson, one that he would never forget. Humanity was not to be underestimated. They were survivors, fighters, and above all, they were unafraid. In the aftermath, as Earth began to rebuild, there was a quiet understanding among its people. They had faced the impossible and come out victorious. Not because of their technology or weapons, but because of their will to survive. And as they looked to the stars, they knew that they had earned their place in the galaxy. No one would ever question humanity's strength again. For the Draer, the battle for Earth would become a haunting reminder of what happens when you underestimate the indomitable spirit of mankind. And for humanity, it was a victory that solidified their legacy as a species that, no matter the odds, would always endure.